Humanity is set adrift, living within a whirlwind of events, a labyrinth of experience, ecstasy and tragedy, so vaporous and intricate that for many there is no distinguishable pattern, nothing to decipher. Life is a phantom with little meaning or tangible, tactile truth. For those amidst this apparent chaos, nothing is clear or certain. However, all of human history can be represented quite simply as a spiraling movement between opposing ideas and forces towards one of only two possible outcomes: understanding or catastrophe. This progression of time and the development of human awareness flow forward and converge in focused and balanced cycles, inevitably leading to the archetypal clash of opposites, which then give birth to new and great ideas. There are those who steward over this natural cycle of events, allowing the course of history to find its own way, and eventually, its own moments of clarity. But this is not the whole story, for there are also others who have the knowledge and ability to interfere in the natural progression of events, who consciously manipulate the meeting of opposites, luring men to catastrophe and away from understanding. In this series, we will explore the elements of this vast and imperative conflict, which, at this very moment, is about to engulf all of mankind.
And now then, because we are introducing this amazing item for the first time in this country, it isn't going to cost you 1 cent.
Exploring tomorrow.
Before delving into the facets of collectivism, we must first understand one of its most essential tenets, a belief which skews and warps the collectivist philosophy, making it a destructive force of imbalance. This belief is the almost religious conviction that man is born as a blank slate. Collectivists believe that a human being's nature is entirely determined by the environment into which he was born, that he is therefore a product, an amalgamation of his surroundings and experiences. Take these away, and he becomes nothing but an empty shell.
Everything that we understand has been taught to us in some capacity, especially our operations. Every word I'm saying has been taught to me. Every concept has been relayed in some capacity to me, and through my mental operations, which is a form of conditioning, I have arrived at novel conclusions. My originality is simply because of the environmental influences that are completely and utterly conditioned to me as opposed to everyone else. Everyone is different because they come from different conditioning, in other words. The most important is to realize why people behave the way they do. And I argue that it is not genetics, it is behaviorism based on conditioning.
They also believe that morality, spirituality, and ideas of right and wrong are products of environment as well. Good and evil are not tangible realities to them, only illusory constructs created by humanity itself to better function as a group.
Well, what is evil? Define it for me. What causes evil? What causes someone to behave in an evil manner?
Well, I'm asking you, do you believe evil exists?
Absolutely not, because based on the definition of evil, it's basically a religious connotation. It doesn't mean anything. It's an empty distinction. If I was to redefine it, I'd say evil would be aberrant behavior. And if I was to define aberrant behavior, I would say almost conclusively that aberrant behavior is caused by the necessities of the environment.
This ideology was born from the existentialist movement, which in turn gave rise to moral relativism, which we will discuss later in this series. The problem with the blank slate theory is that it is entirely false. As has been proven in the fields of linguistics, mathematics, and Jungian psychology, among other disciplines.
There are a number of reasons to doubt that the human mind is a blank slate. And some of them just come from common sense. As many people have told me over the years, anyone who's had more than one child knows that kids come into the world with certain temperaments and talents. It doesn't all come from the outside. Oh, and anyone who has both a child and a house pet has surely noticed that the child exposed to speech will acquire a human language, whereas the house pet won't, presumably because of some innate difference between them.
In 1957, a professor by the name of Noam Chomsky published a monograph on modern linguistics called Syntactic Structures. The piece revolutionized the manner in which language was studied and brought a resounding challenge to the proponents of the blank slate theory. Blank slate scholars in the field of linguistics maintained a structuralist view of language. To them, language was a purely social phenomenon, like tool-making or table manners. Language was simply a product of environment, just as man was simply a product of environment. Deeper questions of language and mind, including how young children can dope out their native language from the wash of adult talk surrounding them, were never considered. But Mr. Chomsky was deeply troubled by this account. In the mid-1950s, he began wrestling with questions he felt the structuralists could not answer. If language was simply learned behavior, what gave people the ability to produce and understand an infinite number of sentences, including those that had never been uttered before? How did children acquire language seemingly spontaneously, without being overtly taught? What Chomsky soon discovered was that language was not at all a product of environment, and that the structuralist view explained almost nothing about the origins of verbal communication. Chomsky turned to what he called a generative view of linguistics, finding that the basic roots of language are inherent in every human being at birth. Language, Mr. Chomsky came to believe, was rooted not in behavior, but in biology, in an inborn set of principles that speakers unconsciously draw on whenever they produce or understand sentences. The goal of linguistics, he argued, should be to reproduce these principles. Ultimately, he said, the aim of linguistics is not so much to formulate the grammars of specific languages as to describe a universal grammar, a model of the shared properties that underpin all human language. It is these universal principles, Mr. Chomsky argued, that all people are born knowing and that allow children to acquire whatever native language they're exposed to. Even a man such as Chomsky, notorious for his extremely rationalist view of the world, could see that human beings were more than empty vessels to be filled with whatever knowledge and experiences were made available by their environment. Humanity was something much more, born with faculties and gifts that science could not explain away. Chomsky is far from being alone in this assessment. On January 20th, 2006, the London Telegraph reported on a study by the journal Science involving intricate geometric tests on the tribal Munduruku, who live deep in the jungles of Brazil, a people who had never before been exposed to advanced mathematical concepts. It was widely believed by the scientific community prior to the study that the ability of tribal adults in the Amazon to conceptualize numbers was no better than that of infants, that without words for specific numbers, a number sense cannot develop, that mathematics was learned through environment with a set of specific concepts and communicated through an adequate and learned language. The blank slate theory rears its ugly head once again. However, science refuted the blank slate assertion, finding that, as many mathematicians have claimed, the new study shows that the most basic concepts of math, space, time, and number, are hardwired in the human brain and independent of language. Researchers in France and at Harvard University found that the Munduruku readily grasp basic concepts of geometry that would have been familiar to the ancient Greeks, such as point, line, parallel, and square versus rectangle, said co-author Professor Stanislas Dehaene of the Collège de France in Paris. He added that earlier studies totally underestimated the amount of proto-mathematical knowledge that is shared by people who lack the language to express these ideas. More and more, scientists are beginning to discover that most knowledge is in fact not learned, but inborn, that our environment rarely determines anything except the ease or difficulty by which we learn to express these ideas to others, or discover them within ourselves. This is the essence of individualism. Even in the face of adverse conditions or hardship, every human being is his own product.
1642, try 612.
He is born with an undiluted knowledge, and he has the power to choose how he will discover it and what he will use it for. This type of individualism is a significant threat to collectivists. In order for collectivist ideas to take hold in a society, people must first be convinced that they themselves are empty. They must be influenced to accept that it is the environment that determines their fate and not their own will. Collectivism requires man to be a piece of the whole, but not whole himself. A totalitarian structure is easily born under such conditions. Men who forget their individualism often hand over their free will to those who appear to have the greatest influence over the environment. This is, of course, a sleight of hand. To put it simply, a collectivist system cannot control you, but it will attempt to convince you that you need the environment that the system provides.
And now then, because we are introducing this amazing item for the first time in this country, it isn't going to cost you 1 cent. All you have to do is sign this little scrap of paper, and you get your bottle absolutely free.
I hereby turn over to ISM Incorporated everything I have, including my freedom, and the freedom of my children and my children's children, in return for which said ISM promises to take care of me forever.
If a man does not need the system, why be a part of it at all? Why conform to the chain of mores that holds it together when a man derives his mores and his meaning entirely from his own soul? In a world of individuals, collectivism falls apart. For a collectivist system to survive, it must breed out individualism. This is the inevitable result of any society that prizes the needs of the many over the needs of the one.
Don't grieve, Admiral. It is logical. The needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few.
or the one.
All they have to do is claim that their action is for the greater good of the greater number, you see. Now that's one of the foundations of collectivism. Now the individualist, on the other hand, and that's the other side of the debate, the individualist looks at society and says, wait a minute, what is this thing called group? Can you see a group? And you can't. You can only see individuals. The word group is an abstraction. It's a word concept. It's an image in the mind of something that doesn't really exist, except to the extent that individuals exist. It's like the word forest. There's no such thing as a forest. There are only trees. You can see trees, but you cannot see forests. So it's an abstraction. When you then, therefore, base a political philosophy on an abstraction, and you say that this abstraction has rights that are greater than the individual, you've made a huge mistake.
Collectivism is not a new idea. It is a fundamental part of the human psyche, often preempting all other instinctive concerns. Cognitive thinkers attribute this to man's need for survival and safety in numbers, but this is a very simplistic view. The reality of collectivism is much more complex. Tribalism, city-states, countries, empires could not exist without man's natural tendency to join into collectives. However, even more than survival, the collective fulfills a spiritual need. This need is rooted deeply in the psyche of human beings from the moment of their birth, and stems from what the psychologist and philosopher Carl Gustav Jung termed the collective unconscious. Early in his work, Jung discovered a psychological link, mostly unconscious, between all people. This link reveals itself in symbols that are common to the dreams, art, and culture of every human being, regardless of the time or place they lived, regardless of environmental conditions or family structure. These symbols, and the knowledge they contain, exist within our psyches from the moment we come into the world. They are called archetypes.
If you've ever taken anthropology, you know that it's a kind of an occupational pleasure of anthropologists to show how exotic other cultures can be, and that there are places out there where supposedly everything is the opposite to the way it is here. But if you instead look at what is common to the world's cultures, you find that there is an enormously rich set of behaviors and emotions and ways of construing the world that can be found in all of the world's 6,000 odd cultures.
Well, for instance, among the Navajo Indians, healing ceremonies were conducted by way of sand paintings, which are mostly mandalas, on the ground. And this idea of sand painting with mandalas appears also in Tibet.
Now, what do you make of that in two very different cultures, the same imagery emerges?
Yes. Well, there are only two ways to explain it, and one is by diffusion, that an influence came from there to here, and the other is by separate development. And when you have the idea of separate development, this speaks for certain powers in the psyche which are common to all mankind. Otherwise, you couldn't have, and to the detail, the correspondences can be identified. It's astonishing when one studies these things in depth, the degree to which the agreements go between totally separated cultures. That was Carl Jung's idea, which he calls the archetypes of the collective unconscious.
What do you mean by archetype?
An archetype is a constant form, a basic fundamental form which appears in the works of that person over there and this person over here without connection. And they are expressions of the structure of the human psyche.
Archetypes are as yet undefined structures of knowledge, intrinsic to the human psyche, often termed as complexes. Normal complexes develop through experiences, nurturing or debilitating, which form connecting strands of information that are unconsciously linked. Archetypes, however, are not formed through experience. As a person grows, the unconscious mind begins to apply symbols to the archetypes in order to better communicate the information existing in them to the conscious mind. Since these symbols are common to all cultures and peoples, regardless of environmental circumstances, Jung's discovery led him to conclude that this inborn information was not coincidental, but universal. Humanity was tied together by an unseen but intuitively felt network. He also found that only through individuation, the process of awareness and coming to terms with one's own unconscious, could a person understand this collective unconscious. Ironically, only by being psychologically and spiritually free from the collective could one come to understand and appreciate his connection with the greater whole. In ancient alchemy, this was called microcosm and macrocosm, the whole within the whole. This concept has found a place in almost every religion on Earth, but its meaning is often suppressed by collectivists, who recognize it as a threat to the centralization of power. Jung's archetypes are tangible proof that humanity is linked together in a great chain by something we do not fully understand, something timeless and universal, which binds the hearts of men together. The emotional need to understand the collective unconscious is what draws us towards collectivism, far more even than the need for survival. Collectivists attempt to distract people away from this very real and pre-existing connection, causing them to feel isolated and out of balance. They then replace the missing connection with a fabrication of their own design, often a social power structure used to dominate the masses. However, only individuation can allow mankind to truly understand his ties to others and the world around him. Therefore, only a society or collective that promotes man's innate psychological and spiritual individuality can succeed and support humanity indefinitely. A collective of individuals. Throughout history, there have only been a few barely realized collectives of individuals. All have been violently wiped out by men who desire a different kind of collective, in which individuality is reserved for the few. The many are wrapped in the bondage of the blank slate mentality, slaves to their environments. And the one, the source of all wisdom and freedom, no longer exists.
The ideology that will construct our new world, so to speak, is an ideology based on resource management as denoted through the scientific method.
The unification and pacification of the nations and peoples of the earth.
Yeah, exactly. You're saying instinct has nothing to do with it. This is
it's imprinting.
We need a world peace upheld by a world government. The leaders of the nations, with the consent of the people, should gather together to abolish war and establish world unity.
There are no actual human instincts, and I have tons of science to back this up.
That education should be universal and compulsory.
John, this is happening everywhere in the world.
We must fight to regain our freedom, or everything is lost. Everything.
Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine.
When anybody preaches disunity, tries to pit one of us against the other, you know that person seeks to rob us of our freedom and destroy our very lives. And we know what to do about it.
And now, gentlemen, no violence, please. Don't... Oh, hey!
That is the secret of American prosperity.
Ha ha ha!